Sourdough's one of those breads. It was for the poor, the traveler, the person who didn't have access to the finer things in life. Sourdough was a food people used to look down on. It was for the miner, the homesteader, the person living remote. But you needed it because the store was far away and you needed to be able to take care of yourself. If you wanted to eat anything that wasn't dense as a rock, you had to learn how to do this. And that's the kind we're making today. English muffins, apple butter fritters, both made the frontier way, with no store-bought yeast. In other words, sourdough. If you're nervous about starting sourdough, I am too. I'm only a couple weeks into it, but there's a few things that I've picked up just at this start that have made the whole process easier. There are some tricks and there are some particular recipes that I've tried that make this process a whole lot more fun. So come along with me today. I thought we'd fire up the wood stove, cook English muffins, sourdough donuts, and show you a few other recipes that have made the start of the sourdough journey a lot more manageable. And who knows, if you want to try the flavor, that flavor your ancestors knew so well, you might find that same little bit of courage I did to just dive right in. Even when it's not going to go perfectly, it's still going to taste good. It has so much flavor. Sourdough English muffin, butter, and choke cherry jelly. It doesn't get a whole lot better than that. If you ask me, small foods like this are the way to start doing sourdough. We're keeping up with the pioneer traditions. They probably would have ate things a lot closer to this. Don't try to do the fancy, mountainous loaves of bread. Those are hard. This is easy. Just do what your ancestors did. Make English muffins. All you need for these breads we're making today is a fire and some cast iron. No oven. Back when an oven was a luxury that few people had, men and women headed west to the frontier and they made bread right on top of their wood stoves, their cook stove, and their campfire skillets. And what they couldn't afford was yeast from the store. So they made this, and it soon became a Wild West tradition. But I guarantee you they were eating a lot more sourdough pancakes, fried dough, and small breads like this than any big, giant, crusty loaves. Okay, to make an old recipe like this, we need the basics of sourdough checked off our list. That first step began a week ago in the kitchen with a handful of flakes. These dehydrated flakes are what the journey starts with, and how we get to the English muffins and fritters that we're about to eat today. So this handful of flakes got dropped into water and flour, mixed up, and left to awaken. Back in the old days, the flakes would not have looked so perfect, but the idea was very similar. People took a hunk of wet dough, rolled it in a bunch of salt, and tucked it in their pocket. And off they went across the Great Plains, north to Alaska, or onto sailing ships around the Horn. Sourdough went with them. It's not a fancy bread. It's a dead, humble bread. We don't need to be intimidated by it. So while a gold miner might have scraped that salt off and dissolved his lump of bread in water, we're doing pretty much the same. The dehydrated flakes slowly dissolve in that warm water and flour. I fed water and flour every 12 hours or so, day after day, not expecting much, until it became obvious that that soupy lump was in fact growing. It didn't double in size right away, it just slowly started to bubble, to rise up and then fall back down over the course of hours. For me, that took about 5 days of regular feedings, every morning and night. That probably took 30 seconds each time. Remember, sourdough is a way to get yeast so that you don't have to buy it every time you try to bake. So this yeast is a living thing, and as you bake with it, it's what creates the light, airy bubbles and texture in your food. Okay, but practically speaking, what does that look like? I started with just feeding it a tablespoon of flour and a tablespoon of water. And then as it got bigger, I fed it about a 1-to-1-to-1 ratio of flour and water to however big the starter was. So when I had a quarter cup of starter in the jar, I fed a quarter cup of water and a quarter cup of flour. And then I just left it to get on with it. Obviously, you get to a point where the math makes you realize you have a full jar of dough and it has no more room to feed it anymore. This is where I discarded some, and I made my first batch of English muffins with that extra. That was maybe day 3 or 4, and the sourdough yeast was waking up but not at full strength yet. So I just tossed in a teaspoon of active dry yeast with this same recipe that we're making today, just to hedge my bets. And it worked. That helped give it just a little extra rise, in case my yeast wasn't powerful enough yet on its own. It's hard to know what you're looking for when you've never made anything like this. It's like anything. It's easy once you've done it 100 times, but until then, you don't even know what you're looking for. So that first batch of English muffins used up half my sourdough starter, which meant I now had less to feed every day. And that's pretty much how it goes from there on out. You feed it, you use half, then you feed it again. If you want it to slow down, you just put the jar somewhere cold. So you can see how this process becomes a regular pattern. Feeding flour and water, leaving the yeast to consume it, and then when it's hungry again, you feed it again. Now, do you think pioneers babied their sourdough starter? No. They didn't pamper a glass jar full of it. They likely held over lumps of bread dough, and then they just dissolve and reuse it for the next baking time. If a San Francisco gold miner could do it in 1849 while he was panning for gold next to a creek, we can do this. So, for me, I decided not to let modern sourdough masters intimidate me by making this process seem like it has to be perfect. Alright, first things first, let's get more of this kindling split because this is how I'll control the heat of the griddle, one small piece at a time. This wood is all left over from the sawmill when we repaired this 1889 homestead house last year. It splits easy and it'll do the job. Okay, so the cook stove has been lit, the firewood is chopped. Let's make our first recipe, English muffins. We've got our half a cup of sourdough starter that's been bubbling away on the kitchen table, and I'm gonna add a cup of milk to it along with 2 cups of flour. We mix it all up, and that's gonna work its magic overnight. I'm not gonna knead it, I'm not gonna do any stretching, it's just gonna sit there overnight. Now, with that done, it's on to the rest of the ingredients. So, a tablespoon of honey or sugar, a teaspoon of baking soda, a teaspoon of salt, half a cup of flour, give or take, just to make this dough a little more easy to work. And then finally, there's going to be some cornmeal that goes on the tops and the bottom of each muffin. But we'll get to that step in just a sec. Okay, so with all the ingredients in a bowl, we're going to stir that up with the top of a spoon or a spurtle or just our hands. And basically, we're going to stir or knead that for 4 minutes, 5 minutes, enough that the gluten and the sourdough starter are mixed into everything and they start to really work. It's on to cutting out the individual circles now. The dough has such an interesting feel to it here. I've made this recipe where it's more wet, I've made it where it's more dry. Personally, this batch feels a little bit wet, but we're here and this is how it goes. So we'll push on. It's probably a bit overproofed, seeing as how it took me some time to get the cook stove going in this old drafty cabin, and I let it sit a little too long here or there. But this is all going to work out. This is part of why people often cooked smaller breads, not giant voluminous loaves. Because small breads are just more forgiving. So sourdough is one of those things that is, I don't know, it just seems really intimidating. It's something that I never really wanted to try because it just seemed so finicky and scientific. You gotta know humidity and temperature and hydration. There's just all these words I don't particularly understand. But if you realize that it came over in the backs of wagon trains, right? This bread is considered the stuff that kept people alive when they came west. And so if I think of it that way, this is very doable. This has been done before. If you were wealthy, if you lived in town, you didn't bake sourdough. You went to the store and you bought yeast cakes, or you went to your brewer and you got yeast from him. Sourdough has a tangy, sour flavor. And throughout most of history, that was looked down upon. That was viewed as something that the poor would eat. Just like a wheat bread or a bread made with a lot of whole grains. You know, that was something for the poor. The whitest, softest, least burnt part of a piece of bread. That's what the rich wanted. And the poor, they got everything else. But of course, the joke was on them because the really nutritious food, it's the fermented bread. It's the bread that uses whole wheat, whole grains. And that was the food of the poor, of the common man. So he actually got the better end of the deal. And I think today in our modern world, but we've almost gone the opposite direction where we make sourdough bread or whole grain bread. We make that an elite kind of bread. So in today's world, we flip this whole thing on its head. But it doesn't have to be that way. And I think that's the kind of bread that I want to make, especially out here in a cabin like this. I want to make the bread our ancestors ate, a sourdough bread, basically a fermented bread. It's the way people got their yeast when they lived out in places like this. And it has such a unique flavor that's all its own. That's the kind of bread I want to taste. That's the kind of bread I think I can talk myself into the courage to make. It's one of those flavors you just can't get anywhere else.
Okay, let's get these English muffins off of the griddle and give them a taste. I've tried to keep the iron at a low temperature so that the bottoms get good color but don't burn. Each side cooked for, about 5 minutes, with me fuffing about and fiddling with them to make sure they weren't getting blackened. So I kind of flipped them back and forth. The trick with these is to let both sides get cooked, but to really do it low and slow so that middle isn't doughy. That just takes some time, but it's certainly not tricky. After about 10 minutes, I think they've cooked long enough. Let's give these a try. And of course, the only right way to open them is with a fork, never with a knife. We're looking for nooks and crannies, and no dough in that center. Ooh, that's a beauty.
Okay. We have the perfect English muffin. And we even have the bonus of choke cherry jelly that the kids and I made this summer.
Choke cherries are a native shrub to Montana, and they have these dark red, black berries in the fall that can be really sweet, but also have a bit of a bitter choke cherry flavor to them. So not everybody loves them, but when you make them into a jam, they have a great flavor. And this batch turned out particularly good. So let's give it a taste test. And then it's on to one final bread and final method that makes sourdough so much easier to get started with.
It has so much flavor. That little bit of sourness from the sourdough, it's not too much. It just gives it a tang. It gives those levels of flavor that, a normal yeast bread just can't compete with. This is incredibly good. Now, if I hadn't let that stove go out, I would absolutely toast the English muffin because I think that's the best way to eat it. But the stove is too cold and I don't want to spend all that time getting it hot again just to toast a piece of bread. I wish Robbie hadn't had to go back to the shop, but he's working on getting the farm equipment ready for spring. And I've got to go get the kids in just a minute. But I get just this little moment just for me.
But before I go, there's one more bread recipe that again uses no oven, but is packed with flavor and history. It just uses some leftover sourdough that has been keeping in a cold place for more than a day, plus apple butter and cardamom. And I bet it will get Robbie out here to eat with me before it's time for more farm work. So let's get some hot oil going and have a treat straight out of history. Unlike the English muffins that were baked on the griddle, this sourdough is going to be fried. Hot lard or oil will work equally well here. This is just your standard bread dough that everyone in history would know. Flour, water, and salt, with a helping of sourdough starter. Mix it, stretch it, knead it for a few minutes, ferment it for 10 hours, or pop it in a cold place like the fridge for a couple days, which is exactly what I did. This recipe doesn't care. It's not fiddly. And today it's begging for something sweet. An apple chopped up finely and sprinkled over the rolled out dough adds natural sweetness. And a smooth, thin layer of apple butter is about to give it depth. Old-fashioned spices are needed though, and that's where a dash of cloves, a teaspoon of cinnamon, and a pinch of cardamom make this a devilishly good dessert. I'm taking those spices and pouring them into a mason jar that has a little bit of cinnamon and sugar already in it. A good shake and everything's mixed up. Now it's time to sprinkle it over the whole dessert. I could make a special glaze for these fritters with molasses or maple syrup, but the easiest thing to do is to hold some of this back and then roll the hot fritters in the cardamom sugar at the very end. Efficient and delicious. After all, the less dishes I have to wash in a one-room cabin with no running water, well, the happier I'll be.
You can hear the wind whipping over the roof. It's a beautiful sunny day, but that wind is starting to really kick up, as is the way in spring in Montana. So I think we're gonna hear that wind noise in the background all day. But first things first, I'm getting this oil slowly warming up on the stove because this is a clay pot and I don't wanna go from really cold to super hot right in a flash. So slowly warming it up.
Okay, we have our layer of sourdough, apple butter, chopped apple, and spices. Now it's time to roll. We get that filling rolled in tight, and then I take the rolling pin and give it a good flattening out. Then we slice, making rectangles full of apple goodness. Now, this is the time to use the smallest pot you've got for frying, because that lard or oil is going to get a few stray apples swimming in it, and it may not be usable again. I guess it depends how desperate you are, but I like to fry in a pretty shallow oil in a deeper pot, so that it can't bubble over too easily and I don't waste too much.
I think we need to hang up that copper pot though, because I don't have a good spot for it. So I think we need to make a spot. Yes.
We cooked a porcupine in this old copper pot last week, and I think it's a keeper. But of course, I can't find a hammer to save my life. So we improvise. Let nothing slow us down. Those fritters are bubbling away great, and this big pot has a permanent new home on the original 1889 north wall. Looks great. And just in time, too, for our special guest to show up.
Hey.
Hey, hon.
Smells delicious.
The cardamom and cinnamon in the air are calling. Let's sit down and give this a taste test. But first, let's roll it in that spiced sugar mix. Robbie, what do you think?
Oh, these are wonderful.
Hardworking hands. Okay, my turn.
Hot.
That molten apple butter is oozing out. The spices give it an old-fashioned flavor. And judging from the fact that we cleaned up the tin of fritters, well, I'm in no doubt that these are a hit. Worth stopping combine repairs to come out here to Uncle Dan's and have a quick break. Sourdough can be so versatile, and these two recipes prove it.
But I think these kinds of foods go to show you don't have to be a master of it. You know, yeah, if you did it every day of your life, you could really get exceptionally good. Even though this dough may be overproofed a bit too much, it doesn't matter. The end result is incredible. So if this gives you any confidence to start, do what I did. Just jump in. Don't try to do the fancy, mountainous loaves of bread. If you ask me, this is the way to start doing sourdough.
Uncle Dan's, it is a very good house, and we can live there.
I love that. Thanks, Georgie.